Hey Optimancers, Chris here. In this series I've been discussing the ranks of every subclass in the game, and so far I've looked at all the artificers, barbarians, and bards. Here's where our rankings currently stand. So today is the big one. 14 subclasses to look at for the Cleric. That's the most of any class in the game. And it's a lot of material, but by the end of this video, we'll have ranks for all of them. If you would like to support the content on this channel, please check the link in the video description for my Patreon. Patrons of this channel see these videos early and non-monetized, and my top-level patrons can join me to play some D&D every month. Today, I'd like to recognize these top-level patrons. Bloody Nine, CJ, Cass Byrne, Christian Wyndham, Unknown Watcher, Condor, Dank Train, Dash Panther, Dave Peters, and David F. Thank you all so much for your support. Let's get started. Here's where I go over how the ranking system works. So, if you watch the previous videos, this is going to be a repeat for you, so you just can click on the next chapter in the timeline. So here is how it will work. I will not be discussing any subclass that is not official content. So subclasses that are third-party or playtest material are not included. This is a power ranking, so I'm not taking into account how well they are designed in this ranking, or my personal preference. This will take into account how powerful they are as a single class build, as well as how powerful they are when multi-classed. I will be assuming feats are allowed and used, and that all the optional class features in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything are allowed as well. Just some things to note as well. Features are weighted by how soon they are received. A feature you get at level 3 is much more valuable than a feature you get at level 10, because these features see way more gameplay when you actually play the subclass. So this is not a comparison of which of these subclasses are more powerful at 20th level. I don't think that's very relevant to players. This is a comparison as to which you will find most powerful, assuming you are starting at low level and advancing levels through gameplay. A feature you have for 100% of that time is 5 times more valuable than a feature you're going to have for 20%. And although I will consider all 3 pillars of gameplay, I will be weighing the combat tier most heavily. The combat tier tends to be the tier that is most reliant on mechanics, and mechanics is what I'm looking at here. I also assume you will not be playing as a solo character. So features that work well with teammates, or even better, improve your teammates, will be considered in the ranking. Now before we begin, I'm going to address a couple common misconceptions before they come up. A bad feature does not make a subclass less powerful. I can add 10 terrible and practically useless features to the most powerful subclasses, and they're still the most powerful. I'm only looking at features that make a subclass better. Secondly, just because a feature can be replicated with a feat does not mean the feature isn't good. Feats are not free, and they can be very powerful. They can even be more powerful than a subclass feature. So, a feature that can be replicated by a good feat can still be a great feature, improving the power level of the subclass. And the person playing that subclass has 1 extra feat they can use on any of the many potent feats in the game. I guarantee you're not going to have enough feats, and having 1 more is a big benefit. These rankings, of course, are subjective, and I don't expect anyone to agree with them in their entirety. And I do have some personal biases, which will probably become apparent. I like spells. I think they can be very powerful. And that's going to be clear enough as we move forward. Also, I should say, I like to make my saving throws, and I don't care who knows it. Give me a way to do that more reliably, and I'm likely to consider a subclass more powerful because of it. Finally, I don't assume you will be limited to 1 encounter per day. I don't assume you will have short rests whenever you want. So features that can be used more often I consider to be more powerful than single-use ones. Now, this is a very common rating system in D&D for the ranking of classes and subclasses, and it includes anywhere from the S tier being the highest and the D tier being the lowest, and I will not be using it. Instead, I'll be using this expanded tier chart that includes an E and F tier. Here are the criteria I will be ranking the subclasses with. If I give a subclass an S tier ranking, I don't just think it's powerful. I think it's probably too powerful. I think there are some potentially game-breaking mechanics involved, and these are going to come into play without requiring high-level play at all. My issue with these subclasses is you have a real possibility of invalidating other player character features. This can lead to overshadowing other players, and so if you're a power gamer, these options are for you. If you aren't, I think I would think carefully before selecting an S tier subclass. If I give a subclass an A tier ranking, I think it's a very powerful option. Characters using an A tier subclass are easy to optimize and have features that should be showstoppers in gameplay, stomping down challenges with abandon. We may not break the game, but we're definitely going to make it a fair bit easier. If I give a subclass a B tier ranking, I think it's a good subclass. Optimizing a B tier subclass should result in a very effective character that has a strong contribution to a party of characters. Even with limited optimization, a B tier subclass is probably still going to be reasonably effective. If I give a subclass a C tier ranking, I think it's a decent option. Optimizing a C tier subclass may require a bit more thought about how to make the best use of the features, but they can still be quite effective if handled with some thought and consideration. If I give a subclass a D tier ranking, I think it's serviceable. Optimizing a D tier rank subclass will lead to a decent character that can usually still pull their weight, but I wouldn't expect to stand out. If I give a subclass an E tier ranking, I think it's a weaker option. An E tier subclass needs some extra effort to make a character that contributes effectively at all, or perhaps the contributions they make end up being extremely narrow, or rely heavily on other characters helping them out. It's still possible to make a character that can be somewhat effective with an E tier subclass, but if you just play it as it's presented, you can probably expect a disappointing experience. If I give a subclass an F tier ranking, I think it's basically unredeemable. An F tier ranked subclass differentiates from an E tier subclass because it is bound to disappoint, and there just aren't any good ways to optimize it to make it worthwhile. And the F tier subclasses, along with the S tier subclasses, I think can be a problem when considering a team of players because they create pretty overwhelming imbalance. Subclasses aren't balanced against each other, and that's normally okay. But when you have these extreme cases on either end, it can weaken the game. When subclasses receive the same rank, I will be placing subclasses I think are more potent, more to the left of the chart, with the weaker further to the right. So at the end of this series, I will have a comprehensive list from top to bottom of every class and subclass combination in the game, all 114 of them. So first off, let's look at what the Cleric provides as a chassis. We have D8 hit points, middle of the road, simple weapons, wisdom and charisma saving throws, and the standard 2 skill proficiencies. The first standout feature for clerics is armor proficiency. All clerics are proficient in medium armor and shields, so that is uniquely effective for a full spellcaster. Now technically it's not a unique feature for a full spellcaster because druids do get the same proficiencies, but druids have that restriction where they don't wear metal armor, and hide armor and half plate are two very, very different armors. Now, the other full spellcasters can get medium armor and shield proficiency. I mean, they can even get heavy armor proficiency, but they need to either take the right subclass or feat or dip into another class. But with the Cleric, it's built right into the class, and it's also right at level 1. Clerics get their subclass right at level 1 as well, and they're one of only 3 classes in the game where that happens. At level 2, Cleric gets Channel Divinity, and as of Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, this becomes a consistently good ability. The option to turn undead, which eventually destroys weaker undead, is very powerful, though it only works against undead, of course. And then your subclass is going to provide you another use, but even if you don't get a chance to use either, you can now expend your Channel Divinity and regain a spell slot. This will be a first level slot until 5th level, and you can start using this ability more than once per day at 6th level. Though, assuming you're getting your Channel Divinities back because you're taking short rests, you're not going to be able to use it over and over again. At 8th level, every Cleric subclass gets either a cantrip boost or a weapon attack boost. But as of Tasha's, pretty much every Cleric now gets both, and the boost is a D8 Radiant. A Cleric, they could choose to keep their original feature that's gained through the subclass, but I think in most cases, the Tasha's option is the way to go. So I won't really be looking at the individual 8th level options, since every Cleric gets the Tasha's option, which I think is pretty much as good, or in a lot of cases better. So I don't think any of the individual 8th level features are making the subclasses rank differently. Then we get Divine Intervention at 10th, and it's potentially quite powerful, but it's also extremely unreliable. And then the subclasses, they all get a 17th level ability, and I'm not going to be talking a lot about those because they're gained at such a late level. Of course, whenever we talk about a full spellcaster, the main draw of the class is spells. And I'll start out by saying that every spell list in the game is good, because spells are good. And I can look at any spell list in the game and point out some great spells. But I will say this about the Cleric spell list. Of all the full spellcasters, I consider it the weakest. And yes, Bless, Spirit Guardians, Revivify, Heal, Aid, and more, I can point to many great spells on the Cleric spell list. But I can do that with any spell list. But what I can't do with the Cleric spell list is find the good versatility that's in the other lists. Clerics can heal, they can do damage, and they can provide protection, but they can't control the battlefield. Their summoning options come on way late in their careers. Teleport and maneuverability options are much, much weaker, or coming on very late, or both. And they have few mass debuff options, fewer utility options, and in the end, like with all spellcasters, the spells are good, but they just aren't as good as we would normally expect from a full spellcaster. But there are two spellcasting mechanics that do favor clerics. The first is their domain spells, which provide 2 additional spell preparations per level of spell right up to 5th level spells. So this is eventually 10 additional preparations. The domain spells cannot be changed, and they're set by your subclass, and they aren't even necessarily on the cleric spell list. But I'll say right away that for the most part, the domain spells, they're not the spells I would have chosen. You can throw Flaming Sphere and Scorching Ray onto my 2nd level spell preparations, and at least I'll have a fire option if I'm fighting trolls or something, but you're not really adding much in the way of versatility. For the most part, the domain spells are either going unused or they're just another thing that did something similar to what we could already do. The second mechanic that boosts cleric spellcasting is their spell preparation. A cleric can switch out their prepared spells, with the exception of their domain spells, every long rest, and they can choose any spell off the cleric spell list. And I think this mechanic, which sounds so amazing, is where we can really see in practice the limits of the cleric spell list, as there are a number of challenges that other full spellcaster lists could solve that clerics can't. And because clerics have some standout spells and lots of preparations, since they're combining base preparations with domain spells, that I find to a large degree clerics don't switch out their spells much at all, despite the ability to do so. So you end up with a spellcaster with a ton of prepared spells that they can change in a long rest, but they still can have less spell versatility in spellcasting than other full casters. So when it comes to spellcasting, that is the price you pay for armor. This is not new for clerics. They've traditionally had weaker spell lists in earlier editions, and in my opinion, that continues to be the case. Where we do see a difference from previous editions is that hit point recovery is far less centered on clerics than it used to be. Sure, the cleric has some pretty good healing spells, and they are certainly capable healers, but not uniquely so. Lots of classes can recover hit points for themselves or the entire party now, through features, spells, or feats, or even the short rest mechanic, which can recover a ton of hit points. And features like temporary hit points can even effectively replace healing to a large degree. So the Cleric as a chassis is fine. Probably enough to keep any Cleric subclass you choose out of the F tier, because spells are good and they're full casters, even if they're a bit weaker as casters. And they combine this with good armor proficiency, though as full casters, you're going to probably find they're a bit less flashy than some other full casting classes, and that will impact the ratings. So let's dive into the subclasses, because we have a lot to go through. First up is the Arcana Domain. This one was introduced in the Sword Coast Adventures Guide, and it hasn't seen a reprint in any of the main source books. At first level, we get a free Arcana proficiency, which wouldn't be my first choice with a wisdom-based character, but it's okay. Add in 2 cantrips of your choice from the wizard spell list, and now it's pretty solid. You can maybe choose a melee cantrip, or actually get a range cantrip with an attack roll, or a minor illusion, and you get a couple different options. Our domain spells, they're fine. There's some decent spells here, but there's no bangers, and they do little to improve the spellcasting versatility of the Arcana Cleric. Magic Missile is probably a better alternative to Radiant Bolt, and Arcane Eye is a good divination, so it's not a terrible list, but it's not a great list. Our Channel Divinity option at second level is a turn ability that works against Celestials, Fae, or Fiends. But it only works on a single creature, so it's pretty circumstantial, and it's just worse than our turning ability for Undead. Now, at 5th level, you can potentially banish the creature, except only if it's a low challenge rating. And since it's also a single creature that you're targeting, this isn't going to be all that great in practice. At 6th level, the Spellbreaker feature gives the Arcana Cleric a fairly useful boost to healing spells, allowing them to remove a spell effect. This pairs particularly well with mass heals like Mass Healing Word. And I should mention that the 17th level feature is really good, the best of all the clerics, but it comes on late, and I don't think it ends up being much of a factor at all, unless you're going to be playing a super high level one-shot or something. So in the end, Arcana comes in okay at 1st, then okay at 6th, and that's probably it in most campaigns. This really isn't a standout until very high level, but in most campaigns, I think it will do fine, so it ranks a C. Next is the Death Domain. This is a domain introduced as a sample NPC domain in the Dungeon Master's Guide, and it's never been reprinted as a player option in any of the main source books. But I'll still rank it because it is official content. But I wouldn't expect that this one will normally be available to players, though I do know DMs that allow it. At 1st level, you get proficiency in martial weapons, which I guess is fine, but I don't expect you will probably get a lot of value out of that. Then you get Reaper, which is a much stronger ability. Gives you a Necromancy cantrip from any spell list, and a Necromancy cantrip that targets a creature can target 2 creatures if they're standing next to each other. So I'm sure the thought when they created this was you would take Chill Touch and then use it with Chill Touch, but now since Xanathar's, Toll the Dead gives you a saving throw Necromancy cantrip too, and it's on the Cleric spell list. So you could do Chill Touch and Toll the Dead. So this one, it's pretty good. Our domain spells are so-so. There are a few here that are outright bad spells, like Rave Enfeeblement and Blight, but there's some okay spells like Blindness, Deafness, and Animate Dead. So this is not a great domain spell list, but it's not worthless. Our Channel Divinity option is a damage boost to a melee attack. This one I consider pretty bad. We're probably focusing on those Necromancy cantrips, and they aren't melee attacks. So we're usually not going in with a melee weapon because our ability scores aren't made for it. We only attack once because we don't get extra attack. We're probably doing poor damage if we hit. And then we could expend our Channel Divinity to do some decent damage on that one attack. So I guess probably the way this would be used is to ramp up an Inflict Wounds spell. And Inflict Wounds, it's okay. Though usually it's not what I would get excited about with my 1st level slots. I mean, if we want to do an attack roll spell with a Cleric, normally I'd be looking at Radiant Bolt because it does approximately the same damage, except we get range and we get advantage on the next attack as a rider. So I would say Inflict Wounds is going to be the inferior option most of the time. But with this, you need a melee attack, so then Inflict Wounds might be better for a Death Cleric, though not amazingly better, and frankly, I don't think either of them are fantastic uses of your first level spell slots. At 6th level, we can ignore necrotic damage resistance with our spells and our Channel Divinity. And this sounds absolutely amazing. But here's one thing to think about. If we consider Spirit Guardians, we can inflict radiant damage or necrotic damage, and it's one of those rare cases where the mechanics are impacted by alignment. But is necrotic damage that ignores resistance more reliable than radiant damage that doesn't? And honestly, probably not. If I do a filter search for monsters with necrotic immunity, I get 4 pages of monsters, which isn't bad. That's not a whole lot of monsters. But if I do a search for monsters with either radiant resistance or immunity, I get a bit over 1 page. Of course, we might be inflicting necrotic damage through other spells as well, and there are 5 pages of necrotic resistance, so there are a decent number of creatures that this impacts, but not a whole lot. The cantrip doubling, I really think, is the big draw here. And the necromancy damage boosts, they're not a huge deal in my opinion. So I think Death does okay, but is not one of the more powerful clerics. I think it's enough to grab a C ranking, but it's not going to end up being a high C. Next up, we got the Forge Domain. This domain was introduced in Xanathar's Guide to Everything. This is our first cleric with heavy armor proficiency, and at some point, this will probably give us a +1 armor class, though not right away. So just to quickly sum up, you will start with chainmail if you start with heavy armor, or you will start with scale mail if you start with medium armor, and assuming you have a 14 dexterity, they give you the same armor class. But if we go to the top tier for each, half plate and plate mail gives +1 armor class compared to half plate, even if you have the 14 dex. And I'll mention that once now because this will come up over and over. Blessing of the Forge is nice because you can boost your armor for another +1 armor class, and magic armor doesn't come up all that often. Or you could give an ally a magic weapon, which could be really helpful if you're playing with a character that focuses on a specific weapon. Something like a crossbow expert that's using a hand crossbow, they might not find a magic hand crossbow. You can give them one. Our domain spells, again, they're okay. First level, we really aren't getting spells I would ever choose. But you know what? Heat Metal is a solid spell, and Wall of Fire can be decent in the right party. And Animate Objects is a spell I like. So there are some good spells on this list, but most of the list here is filler. Our Channel Divinity option, it's a utility option. I have seen this used as a pretty decent way to convert items a normal party wouldn't even bother trying to lug around into far more compact gold pieces, for example. A 6th level Soul of the Forge gives us another armor class boost and resistance to fire. So Forge comes in mainly as a strong defense option for clerics. You can combine heavy armor and shield with a +1 boost at first, another +1 at 6th, and you can end up with a pretty great armor class. Add on some decent utility and Forge comes in as one of the better cleric options. And it's pretty easy to make a pretty effective character with Forge. I think it's a strong choice for someone newer to the cleric class, and I think it comes in with a little bit higher at a B ranking. Our next domain is the Grave Domain. This domain was introduced in Xanathar's Guide to Everything. At first level, we get Circle of Mortality that boosts our healing when it's used on a creature with 0 hit points, and you get a bonus cantrip, which is Spare the Dying, and you can cast it at range. So how much use you're going to get out of this really depends on, honestly, how many members of your party are going down. If they don't, it is a worthless ability. If they do, you can make use of it, and the more they go down, the more you make use of it. But I will say as well that even if party members are going down, you might consider something like the Aid spell, which this doesn't boost. And it's often the best way to bring up downed allies because it increases their current hit points from 0 to 5, can affect up to 3, and at range. But since there's no roll, there's no boost. Same goes at higher levels when you get the Heal spell. But if you are playing in a party where allies go down a lot, this can still be okay. Our other first level feature, it's not okay though. Eyes of the Grave allows you to detect undead that you in all likelihood already knew were there, because this disappointing feature has a range of 60 feet, does not work through cover, so you can't tell if there's undead in that close sarcophagus over there, or in the next room. It can only really work against invisible undead, though the rules don't even say that invisible creatures are automatically hidden, so it probably doesn't even help you there. And it doesn't help with your attacks against invisible undead either, since it doesn't allow you to see them. You just know their location, and this takes an action. It's usable a limited number of times per day, which probably doesn't matter since it's probably a waste of your action regardless. Then we get to our domain spell list, and this is not strong. Revivify is good once we get to 5th level, but it's also a cleric spell, so this is like one extra 3rd level cleric prep, which is fine, but most of these spells I would not expect to cast. Our Channel Divinity option requires an action. It gives creature vulnerability to the next attack that hits it, whatever damage type it is, before the end of your next turn. This needs to be an attack, so you can't double up like a disintegrate spell or anything like that, because if it doesn't have a to hit roll, and those big damage spells tend not to involve a to hit roll, then it's not considered an attack by the rules. So this is usually pretty so-so, because giving up your action so the next attack does double damage, it seems pretty close to an even trade in most cases, and in this case, you get an even trade that you expend a resource to make. So just a quick voiceover here, because in the initial video, I recommend that you might use this 2nd level feature to replace immunity or resistance to damage with vulnerability. But it doesn't work that way, because according to Xanathar's Guide to Everything, here's the order you apply modifiers to damage. Number 1, any relevant damage immunity. Number 2, any addition or subtraction to the damage. Number 3, 1 relevant damage resistance. And number 4, 1 relevant damage vulnerability. That means if we add vulnerability to a creature with immunity, it is still immune to the damage. And if we apply it to a creature with resistance, we're basically doing straight up damage. So that interaction doesn't work, and so it ends up making a feature that I thought was so-so, probably more on the bad side, unless you come up with some kind of trick to make it work. It doesn't change my ranking for Grave. Most of my ranking for Grave is based on the 6th level feature, which is actually reasonably good, so it isn't going to affect my final ranking. At 6th level, Sentinel at Death's Door allows you to cancel a critical hit against a creature you can see within 30 feet with your reaction. This is limited in use, but can actually cancel quite a bit of damage. So this is actually the first Grave Domain feature I consider to be a good feature. So I think this one comes in weaker than most clerics at 1st level. But the 6th level feature is good enough that I do still think it is a C ranking, but it is on the lower side. Our next domain is the Knowledge Domain, which is right from the player's handbook. At 1st level, we get Blessing of Knowledge, which is basically 2 features combined into one. First, we get 2 skill proficiencies, and they're intelligence-based, all of them. So that's a significant downside. Secondly, we double up our proficiency bonus for those skills, which can really make up for them being intelligence-based. Now, this has come up in comments in one of my previous videos, but for those who are unaware, expertise doubles your proficiency bonus for a skill or a tool. So when a feature says it doubles your proficiency bonus on a skill or tool, it's essentially the same as expertise. It does not stack with expertise. And so essentially we can refer to any feature that doubles your proficiency bonus on a skill as expertise, even if it doesn't specifically call it such. Our domain spells are not amazing, but stronger than most clerical domain lists, I would say. Command is already a cleric spell, but it's solid. Suggestion is solid. Arcane Eye is solid. And I actually think, surprisingly, the standout on this list is Confusion. Clerics don't really get much for mass debuffing, so Confusion helps us round out our spellcasting somewhat here. Our Channel Divinity option basically is a floating skill or tool proficiency we can get temporarily with our Channel Divinity. The duration here is much lower than I would like, and this is very limited in uses, but it's a utility that is of reasonable value. Our 6th level feature is a single target save or nothing happens feature. It can have okay utility, or you could potentially use it in combat to implant a suggestion spell, though in essence you would need to use 2 actions for 1 second level spell. Now this isn't a bad feature, it's fine, but it's not a standout. So knowledge overall is fine. It's a decent domain spell list, an okay first level ability, an okay channel divinity option, and an okay utility option at 6th. So knowledge ranks C, just a bit above grave in my opinion. Our next domain is the life domain. This is probably the most iconic clerical domain, and it's in the player's handbook, of course. We get proficiency with heavy armor, which, as I mentioned before, should eventually provide a +1 armor class, though not right away. And we get Disciple of Life, which gives a boost on the healing of spells that restore hit points of 2 plus the spell's level every time they are used. For a straight cleric, I used to consider this a pretty so-so ability, to be honest. But clerics now get Aura Vitality since Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, and so a 5th level life cleric is going to be able to restore an average of 120 hit points now with that spell. That's pretty good for a 3rd level spell. The big draw here, of course, is taking a single level dip in life cleric to get life berries through the good berry spell. This effectively quadruples the number of hit points restored through good berry from 10 to 40. Now, it has always been my opinion, and this is just my opinion, but I do think, based on the wording of the rules, that the way Goodberry is worded, it shouldn't benefit from Disciple of Life, because Goodberry doesn't directly restore hit points. Instead, it creates an item that can be used to restore hit points. And if that's the logic, then if I had the Healer's Feat and I used a Fabricate spell to create a Healer's Kit, then I should get a +6 bonus to any healing I did with that kit. And that seems really silly to me. But according to the designers, Goodberry plus Disciple of Life works. So a 1 level life cleric dip on your druid or ranger is a really, really good dip. And for this ranking, I'll bend to the word of the designers in how this feature is supposed to work. But in my opinion, they got that one wrong. Our domain list here is filled with spells that are already on the cleric list. So that's a point against. Still, there are some spells on the list I'm going to cast right from 1st level, so it's still better than a bunch of bad spells, even if it really doesn't fill any spellcasting gaps the cleric list already possesses. Our alternative for Channel Divinity is a mass heal for a total of 5 times your cleric level, so say 25 hit points at 5th level. Once again, this is a feature, like we saw with the Grave Domain Cleric, that works a lot better if you have allies constantly going down or nearly going down. Otherwise, this is so-so, as a creature has to be below half hit points for you to provide any healing at all. And the healing total here is not that impressive. 5 times your level is okay, but it's just not a huge amount. Especially considering we're boosting the healing of spells with this domain. A mass healing word cast from a life cleric will likely heal somewhere between double to triple as many hit points, and without the below half hit point limit, for example. The 6th level feature allows you to benefit from your healing spells on others. Now, how this feature works when combined with a spell that may or may not provide healing to creatures other than you when you cast it, like the aforementioned Goodberry spell or a Vitality, I have no idea. I don't know if it might only be used on others if you get the benefit or not. I assume you probably wouldn't get it. It definitely works with Healing Word, though, or Cure Wounds, as long as you cast them on someone else. And then, it's fine. Not fantastic ability, but it's passable. As a straight cleric, I think life does okay. As a 1 level dip, I think it does quite well, at least in certain builds. So I think this one ends up ranking a strong C, and I'll be putting it right on the left side at this time. The next domain is the light domain. This domain was printed in the player's handbook. At 1st level, we get light as a bonus cantrip, and that's okay. I mean, it's a cleric spell already, but, it's a decent cantrip. I just tend not to find that clerics are overly hungry for more cleric cantrips. It's not that deep a cantrip list. Warding Flare, it's nice though. You use your reaction to impose disadvantage on an attack roll against you. It's limited use, and it only works against a single attack. But you know what? When you are a 1st level cleric, that's often enough. I think once the number of attacks start ramping up, this becomes less and less valuable. But my low level light clerics use it all the time, and it gives good effect. Our domain spells have quite a few blast spells, and this is the cleric that gets Fireball. If you consider Fireball a pretty good, but not uniquely good 3rd level spell like I do, then it's still decent, because it does allow us to do a good area of effect, decent damage, range spell, which is something clerics don't get many good options for normally. There are some other okay spells here, but overall this one is fine, and most of the spells are okay. At 2nd level though, light clerics really excel, because Radiance of Dawn is the best mass blast in the game at that level, and by a long shot. And although it scales fairly slowly, it's still decent for quite a while. But at 2nd level, this is about 13 points of damage on average to all creatures of your choice within 30 feet. That's massive for a character level where normally you'd be counting on spells like Thunder Wave for area of effect damage. Our 6th level feature allows us to use our Warding Flare to protect other creatures, but as I mentioned when discussing Warding Flare, this isn't a feature that continues to be all that effective at higher levels, and one reaction for one attack, it's already less valuable at 6th level. The big thing with Light is Radiance of Dawn, which really does make the Light Cleric a standout at low levels. And it's dead easy, and you don't need to work your character around the feature, it's just really good and built in. I think Light manages to sneak into B territory, and I think it's one of the stronger Cleric subclasses. And I'm going to put it to the left of Forge, but I do think it's close between them. The next domain is the Nature Domain, and this one's in the player's handbook. 1st level we get an extra skill with an extra cantrip. The nice thing here is it's a Druid cantrip, which gives us more interesting options, like Shillelagh or Thornwhip. Definitely a significant departure from Cleric cantrips. We also get proficiency in heavy armor. Now, why a nature cleric gets this, I have no idea, but there it is. Our domain list is okay. Now, there are a couple spells that are good. I think Spike Growth is good. I think Plant Growth is good. And they're clearly the standouts on this list. But beyond that, it's mainly utility, and it's a number of pretty bad spells in there too. Our Channel Divinity, I would say, is pretty circumstantial. You can charm animals and plants. Plant creatures are actually very rare in D&D. I only see 3 pages of them total from all sources. Animals are more common, but not super common, and definitely far more rare as we increase in level. So this is just not my favorite, though at least we can use our Tasha's option to get a spell slot if we don't face undead plants or beasts. Our 6th level feature is a bit like an Absorb Element spell, but it's for an ally. That wouldn't be so impressive on its own, but this is not limited in uses, which makes it a bit better. Though I will say that elemental damage is really swingy. You can have a lot of it come up many times all at once, or not at all. And when it comes up a lot, it's often tied to things like attacks, or there's multiple creatures doing the same thing, and then this feature at that time stops being as good as Absorb Elements, because it's only providing resistance once, rather than against several instances of damage, which Absorb Elements can do. So a Nature Cleric can be a bit swingy too. We don't have a Channel Divinity we can count on using, so it will often be a 1st level spell slot once per day, eventually a bit more. We can't count on using our 6th level feature either, so we may just be a Cleric with a Druid cantrip. But you know what? You do some careful optimization and there's things you can do with that. Spike Growth plus Thorn Whip, that's effective, for example. So it's not like you can't make a strong Cleric with nature. But you either have to make some good decisions or be in the right campaign, or to a large degree your subclass may not add much to your class at all. And so I think overall this is a weaker C than other clerics, but it's still very much C tier, and a well-made nature cleric is still a solid character. The next domain is the Order Domain. This was first printed in Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica, and it was reprinted in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, so it should be available in most campaigns. At 1st level we get a skill proficiency and heavy armor, plus 1 armor class eventually, yada yada. Then we get Voice of Authority that allows an ally you target with a spell cast with a spell slot to make a reaction weapon attack. This can be a good feature, but it really does require some planning. Clerics are not constantly targeting allies with spells, and not all our allies are getting much out of a reaction attack. So again, some planning is required if you want this to be effective. Our domain spell list is middle of the road. I think slow is definitely the standout here. Otherwise, there's some okay spells, but nothing else I think is worth calling out. Our alternative channel divinity is a mash charm that works on any creature not immune to charm. The charm creatures also drop what they're holding if you wish. So the variety of creatures this works on is very impressive. But this feature has two, and I mean really big, drawbacks. One is unlike the Nature Cleric channel divinity, they will not become friendly to your allies. So they're just going to attack them. And so that's not great. And this only lasts one round, so the duration is very poor. So those are two pretty substantial drawbacks. Our 6th level feature allows you to cast an enchantment spell as a bonus action a limited number of times per day. I think this one is straight out not as good as it sounds. If you cast a spell as a bonus action, you can't cast a leveled spell with your action. So what are you doing? I guess you could do your lousy channel divinity, or swing a weapon once, or use a cantrip. Is swinging a weapon going to be much better than swinging a spiritual weapon? I mean, maybe you have Booming Blade or something, so it could be, potentially. If clerics had a very strong non-spell action they could do, then this would be better. And that might be possible through multiclassing. But you know what? We are 6 levels in. So this isn't something you can access with a dip. You are heavily invested into Cleric already by the time this comes up. So I think Order does fine. It has some strong options for optimization, and Voice of Authority is something I took advantage of recently as a 1-level dip in my Do-It-All Mage build. So we're in decent C territory, but we are definitely to the left side of life. So Order makes its way onto the chart right there. Next up is the Peace Cleric. This was a new domain printed in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. At first level, we get a free skill proficiency, no big deal. Then we get Emboldening Bond, and this one has a massive impact on the game. And it scales with level, even if you only take this as a 1-level dip. I have seen this in action now many times, in many different groups, with many different makeups, including high-level play. And I can tell you 2 things about it. 1, it is extremely potent, and 2, it will slow down gameplay. I really hate this feature. I can't deny it's powerful, and it becomes more and more powerful as the game slogs on. Then we get our domain spells, and they're fine. Autoluke's Resilient Sphere stands out, and we have some solid clerical spells like Sanctuary and Aid, for example, but overall, it's middle of the road. Our alternate use to channel divinity allows you an opportunity attack avoiding movement, which heals allies you move next to. Peace Cleric in a party of 5 might heal 40 or so hit points from this at level 2. So life clerics who can potentially do 10 hit points of healing at this level and can't heal you past halfway, that's the comparison. So yeah, we are overshadowing the life cleric feature here for sure. Then we get Protective Bond at 6th level, which breaks our Emboldening Bond further. I went through this in detail when I discussed Clerics and Tashes, but basically we can pool hit points with our party, slow down gameplay even further, potentially gain additional tactical benefits from the teleport, and this is strong. I mean, objectively strong. And our Peace Cleric gets some really powerful features that have the potential to overshadow features of other characters, slow down gameplay, and dramatically impact the power level of pretty much any party. And that means we have our first S tier ranking. To be clear, an S tier ranking is not a recommendation, just an acknowledgement that this is probably too good. It is also really unpleasant mechanically in gameplay. The phrase, hold on, did you use your D4? You could use your D4 on this roll. You hear that over and over and over and over, stopping the battle to determine who should teleport to where for what attack. The subclass Peace Cleric does not bring peace to me at all. Next we have the Tempest Domain, which is from the player's handbook. We get martial weapon and heavy armor proficiency, so +1 armor class eventually and all that. Then we get Wrath of the Storm, where we can use our reaction to do some damage to a creature that hits us with an attack within 5 feet. This is limited use, but at first level it's a pretty significant amount of damage. The damage doesn't scale at all, so This is decent at first level, but at higher levels it's trivial. Our domain spell list focuses a lot on blasting, but these are mostly not great blasts. We do get decent battlefield control spell with Sleet Storm, which has some spellcasting versatility, and overall I would still say this is a bit above average for a domain list. At second level we get our alternate use for Channel Divinity, which is Destructive Wrath, and it piggybacks onto a spell we cast to do maximum lightning or thunder damage. That basically comes close to doubling the damage dice. So this can take an okay spell like Thunderwave and Shatter and have it do pretty good damage when you first get those spells. There aren't many spells we actually get that really stand out as levels increase though, so some people will dip 2 levels of Tempest Cleric and mix it with something else, and that can work okay, but there are some stumbling blocks there, and a 2-level Cleric dip is not a minor dip. At 6th level, we get Thunderbolt Strike, which pushes creatures we deal lightning damage to by 10 feet if they're large or smaller. I really almost like this, because there's no save, and it's not limited use, but unfortunately, Tempest Clerics really seem to have way more Thunder options than Lightning options. So this can be hard to use, unless you could mix it with Call Lightning, I guess. And that's normally not a spell I'd be drawn to. But, if you mixed it with this in the right situation, you could use it decently. Now, you wouldn't be able to set up another concentration spell because you'd be concentrating on the Call Lightning, but maybe combine with another player, this might be useful. So, with an above average domain spell list, a decent Channel Divinity, and a couple other reasonable features, one thing Tempest does is diversify to some degree what our Cleric can do. Now, as a straight blaster, I think Tempest is not in light Cleric territory, so this doesn't get past the C tier, but it is a strong C tier, and therefore I'll be moving all these over to the right, and Tempest works its way right there. Next up is the Trickery Domain, which is from the Player's Handbook. At first level we get Blessing of the Trickster, which is basically floating advantage on stealth for one party member at a time with no limits on use or concentration. So obviously the more time stealth is used, the more effective this is. Overall, it's fine. Then we get our domain spell list, and we have Mirror Image, which is fantastic combined with Spirit Guardians, by the way. Pass Without Trace, so even a non-stealth party can become a stealth party. Dimension Door, which is huge on a Cleric. It shores up one of the biggest weaknesses in the Cleric spell list. Polymorph, which is arguably the best 4th level spell in the game. This domain spell list separates itself from other domain spell lists in that there are dramatic spells here that fix gaps in clerical casting. Our Channel Divinity option is an illusionary duplicate of ourselves. There's potentially some utility use here, and potentially you can cause maybe some misdirected attacks in combat, but it uses your concentration, so that's probably not what you want to be concentrating on in combat, though maybe at 2nd level that's not such a big deal, but at higher levels anyway. This isn't one of the better Channel Divinities, so in a lot of cases I expect the spell slot recovery is going to get used. At 6th level we get a short duration invisibility, which doesn't require concentration, that uses your Channel Divinity. If you're concentrating on Spirit Guardians, and you need some movement that won't provoke, and want disadvantage on attacks against you for a round, then this is fair, but it's not amazing. In the end, with Trickery, for me it's all about the spells. And these spells really do make clerical casting compete with some of the stronger full casters. And that puts Trickery in a strong B tier for me, because, as I said, for me, it's often about the spells. Next domain is Twilight, which was introduced for the first time in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. Proficiency in martial weapons and heavy armor, etc., etc. Then Eyes of Night, 300-foot dark vision. That's apparently not an error. 5 times the range of most dark vision, and nearly 3 times the range of the second best dark vision range. And you get it permanently, and you can hand it out to multiple creatures for an hour once per day, or more if we expend spell slots. Just to note, the actual dark vision spell, which is otherwise not a bad 2nd level spell, hands out dark vision to one character with a range of 60 feet. Then we get advantage on initiative, or we can give it to someone else, and we can do this without expending resources, and we can change our selection whenever we want. That is 1st level for Twilight. 1st level. Then we get a domain spell list that's pretty decent. Sleep is amazing at first level, maybe the best spell list in the game at that level, and only Twilight gets it for clerics. Leomund's Tiny Hut is the other standout. Honestly, I don't think this quite matches the Trickery spell domain list, but it is probably the second best list for clerics. Then our alternate use for Channel Divinity provides temporary hit points or can remove the Frighten or Charm condition from your allies, and it's not once, it's every round for a minute. And the temporary hit points scale with your level, and they're pretty high. This completely overshadows every other ability in the game to provide temporary hit points. So you are almost certain to be overshadowing some other party members. Then at 6th level, we get a limited flight ability, which is actually pretty good for clerics, because clerics don't really have much in the way of spells that can do that kind of thing. So ridiculous quantities of powerful features at level 1 and a level 2 ability that is probably game breaking and definitely is going to overshadow other character features. We have another subclass ranked S, and because it comes on stronger earlier, I'll be putting it to the left of peace. And I just want to verify, this is not an endorsement. These subclasses are extremely powerful, so much so you are pretty much guaranteed to hog the spotlight. I hate both these subclasses, not just because they're too powerful, but also I find them too easy. Playing either of these classes isn't clever optimization, because the power is just built in and it's automatic. And I have now had the misfortune of DMing for both these subclasses many times since Tasha's came out, and I can say they reduce my enjoyment of the game, and I can't imagine a bigger condemnation of any subclass than that. And our final domain is the War Domain, which is right from the player's handbook. At first level, martial weapons and heavy armor, and that's pretty fitting, of course, for a War Domain, +1 armor class eventually and all that. Then we get War Priest, which is a limited use bonus action for a weapon attack. I actually really like this at first level, and it's pretty dramatic. And as with a lot of these abilities, I think it's going to continually seem less dramatic as you level up. Our domain spell list is mostly cleric spells and a couple paladin self or mass buffs. This is not one of the stronger domain spell lists. It just doesn't add much in versatility to the cleric, though there are certainly spells you will be casting. Our alternative use of Channel Divinity is called Guided Strike, which is a +10 you can add to an attack roll after the roll is made. +10 is a lot, and definitely capable of turning most misses into hits. So if you're making attack rolls with, say, a Warhammer in combat, it's probably not a big deal. But if we have some kind of high damage attack, then it could be quite good. At 6th level, we can pass off that +10 to someone else as a reaction. This is actually a pretty decent boost, since the odds are there is another player doing more damage with attacks than you are, and again, +10 is a lot. This becomes a very nice way to help the sharpshooter or the great weapon master, for example. And that's the War Cleric. It's decent. I would say it ends up just ahead of Death, but probably just behind Arcana. And that is the full list of clerics, and as we can see, for the most part, they're grouped quite tightly together in the B and C tier rankings, which makes them anywhere from decent to good. The exception are Peace and Twilight, which are both probably broken, probably make the game worse, probably make the game less fun, but are undeniably, mechanically, extremely powerful. And if we bring out our earlier rankings, this is how they position. We can see a pretty busy C tier right now, with Battlesmith and a couple bards very much intertwined within our cleric spread. Next time we're going to be moving on to druids, which have a bit more spread between our various options. So I hope you'll join me for that. Otherwise, until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody. Talk to you soon.